I'm Vincent van Gerven. I am co-director of Punctum Books, which is a scholar and queer-led scholarly publisher. We have existed since 2011, and currently we have over 400 open access books. We are purely open access books in humanities and social sciences, as well as arts and architecture. And we have a wonderful partnership with the UC Santa Barbara Library, already for maybe 5 years nearly. And they really have helped us, especially in the beginning, on getting our hands on the metadata problem that I'm also going to talk about today, and that Emma also really nicely addressed in their partnership with Michigan. So I think that the talks will be nicely complementary. Punctum is also one of the founding members of the Scholar-led Collective, which is currently a collective comprising 6 smaller or medium-sized, however you want to see that, scholar-led publishers. And we are also actively involved in supporting and developing open infrastructure. And as such, I am currently co-lead on work package 5 of the COPIM project that probably most of you by now have heard of, which is in its 3rd year and final year. And this particular work package attends to the development of an open metadata management and dissemination system. And besides that, I'm also a board member of OESPA currently. So COPIM, it's a collaborative project for building infrastructure to support open access books. It's based on kind of this statement that there's no open access without open infrastructure. And I think this is a shared belief amongst everyone collaborating in the COPIM project, is that if we want to have open access, a sustainable way of producing books and journals, then we need to do that on infrastructure that is also open and not, you know, potentially capturable by for-profit larger conglomerates. I'm going to focus mainly on books because that's also what COPIM is interested in the sense that a lot of these infrastructure elements for journals, as we've seen earlier today, for example, with Janeway, are much more developed already. And with books, we're still lagging behind in many of these aspects. So this is a little overview of all the partners of the COPIM project. And let's now move on to the meat. So open metadata for OA publishing. So we currently have a situation in which smaller non-profit or library-based open access publishers often struggle with metadata management and dissemination. And as also like Emma indicated, this is a rather large and complicated problem that, especially when you're a smaller press, maybe with 1 or 2 FTE, especially when you start, is, you know, very difficult to overcome. How to get into these discovery channels, right? How to get your metadata up to a standard that your books can be ingested into a JSTOR, into a DOAB, right? And this is not a small challenge, especially, you know, when the presses are small. Commercial solutions are often expensive, and they're moreover frequently not tailored to open access books, right? So they're tailored to a more traditional offset print production pipeline. And this leads, and this is also how we did it when we started Punctum. We manage our metadata in large spreadsheets, you know, with multiple tabs, and we do everything manually. And I imagine that a lot of, or at least we know from Scholar-led, that a lot of smaller publishers do it precisely this way because it's the most cost-efficient way, but it's also prone to error and it's labor-intensive, right? Then an additional problem is that these dissemination channels want the metadata in a variety of formats, right? There is a large, I mean, Mark being the worst, most likely, of those formats. And I'll talk a little bit about Mark towards the end, because that is certainly the most difficult nut to crack. But all these different platforms, they all want the metadata in different formats according to what they think is the right specification of that format, right? So to get out an ONIX record itself is not enough, but it has to be an ONIX record according to the specifications of Project Muse, because it is such a broad format that allows you to basically describe the text on this, water bottle if you would want to. And then we're dealing also with the fact that the open access book metadata. So like once you get your metadata into the system, a lot of the commercial, or I'm not sure if, for example, OCLC is commercial in that sense, but the larger players in the field often strip out a lot of your metadata if you even put it in, right? And so we have noticed that, for example, libraries getting OCLC records from our books are stripped out with much of the data being lost in the process, right? And so the question is, how do we get actually high quality metadata into library systems? And then finally, metadata is often not explicitly CC0 licensed. In fact, there are some providers that insist on a CC BY or equivalent license, which actually introduces enormous problems, right? Because then at some point you will need to recognize who makes changes to the metadata record in the metadata record, and you get this kind of cascade of meta levels that you absolutely have to avoid. So CC0 is the only viable, as far as I'm concerned, the only viable licensing for metadata if you want to do it properly. And that's not only my opinion, right? So like Plan S, Metadata 2020, Europeania in Europe, which is a conglomerate of museums and culture institutions, to all suggest a CC0 or equivalent licensing of metadata. So we decided to develop within COPIM an open source piece of software that would allow us as presses to tackle some of these problems. And I think we're on the way of addressing them. Not all of them, but definitely a substantial subset. So the first thing that we decided is it has to be open source, and it has to have open documentation so that anyone could use this at any point. So there is a GitHub repository of Toad on GitHub, in which you can, if you would want to fork the entire project, should you be interested. There's extensive documentation, not only of the software, but also of the research that we collectively did behind all the different formats, all the different standards. Emma already mentioned a few standards when it comes to different identifiers. We did extensive research and documentation on all of these because there's a wide variety of programs that use and ingest book metadata, and we try to figure out how to prioritize our development. So all of that research is also available on the GitHub wiki. Then we decided that this should be, we should somehow constrain ourselves, and it should be for open access books. So the entire infrastructure that we built specifically tends to open access books in terms of like what types of licensing is allowed, what types of data you can put, metadata you can put into the backend. It allows actually for journal articles and journal issues. So it's actually compatible with journal metadata, should you be inclined to put that in, but it has really been thought from the perspective of a book publisher. So I'm going to go a little bit through how it looks, the different aspects of the software on the back end. So this is what it looks for me. I actually manage the metadata for Punctum. And this is how it looks for me when I go into the back. So you see we have a 449 works currently right now. Works is our, let's say, overarching category. It contains both books and chapters. Books are monographs, edited collections, and so on, and chapters can be part of that. And then publications are specific instantiations of a work, right? So a work can have a PDF publication and a paperback publication, for example. Series, contributors, imprints, they all kind of speak for themselves. What is interesting is that, so in the backend, I can only access the books of Punctum, but the contributors and the institutions are shared with everybody else on the server, which is currently all the scholar-led presses that use this for their daily metadata management. And this, allows us also to connect books between different publishers, basically. So when I would click, and we'll see this in a minute, on a contributor, then I can see, okay, it has contributed to these and these Punctum books, but also to another book of Mission Press, for example, right? So identifiers. From the start, we wanted to make sure that these records contain data that in the last few years have been absolutely essential in terms of open access books. For example, DOIs are the primary identifier in this sense. The license field, as you can see, just allows for a link to a Creative Commons or equivalent license. So we don't, for example, have fields even for saying this book is copyrighted for these and these regions and so on. So this is not even an option. And this was a conscious choice on our end to really make this a piece of software that is for open access. And so it doesn't allow you to put in, let's say, traditional licensing information. It also allows you to keep extensive records of where your books are housed, right? So Punctum has print books, but also has digital versions of these books. And they are housed on a variety of platforms. And a lot of traditional metadata software does not allow you to keep good track of these types of locations. And so you need another spreadsheet. But here in Toad, you can actually clearly keep track of where is my book currently. And most importantly, what is my canonical version, right? So there is a long ongoing discussion about version of record. And so within Toad, whenever you have a publication that is non-print, or even when it's print, I think, you can indicate this is my canonical version. And for example, when a platform would be so inclined, it can take that canonical version and upload it to itself, right? So for example, with OAPN, and I'll talk about this pipeline in a bit, we send an ONEX record to OAPN and they take the canonical file and they upload it. So for example, for OAPN, we don't even send them a PDF anymore when we upload a book to them. But this is, varies from platform to platform. Then again, and Emma also indicated this, like things like ROR IDs. We also made a conscious choice that we are going to prefer open standards as much as possible, right? And so when it comes to institutions, ROR is currently the open standard. You can just download the entire list. We can do automatic checks against it within the system. So we try to prefer these open standards also within the context of our open source project. I'm not sure if I will talk about this later, but for example, when it comes to identifiers with regarding to subjects, this is really quite difficult, right? Because there's currently THEMA, which is an update from BIC, which is, much more detailed, but unfortunately is not implemented yet anywhere. And so we're still dealing with BISEC and BIC codes, which are proprietary. Therefore, we cannot do automated checks against them because we would be violating the copyright of these code lists. And at the same time, they are much less fine-grained in terms of how you can describe the content of a book. So this is a rather frustrating situation, but we try to push as much as possible people to implement these open standards such that they are also wider adopted, hopefully in the rest of the landscape. And so what you can see here, this is like one of these institutions, Aberdeen University, and you can see also like that members of that institution have contributed to those books from these, I think, two different publishers, right? Open Book and Punctum. And so this allows us also down the line to generate much more interesting metrics about, where do our authors come from? Who do they, where do certain books authors come from? And that again allows us to approach, for example, these libraries at these universities with saying, hey, we publish a lot of books from authors from your university. Maybe you should consider supporting us in one way or the other. ORCID ideas for contributors also now fully the standard. Then multiple output formats and specifications for 10 plus platforms. So this is where we are currently at. This is a little overview of the formats that are currently exportable from Toad, the different specifications, the flavors, if you will, and then which platforms allow the ingest of those flavors. So these are currently the export formats that Toad allows and that we are also actively using. So which means that we no longer have, I think, you know, for DOI deposits, I used to copy things manually. For OAPN, I had a spreadsheet separately that I would export and save as an XLS and then email and so on. And so this has, you know, radically reduced our workload when it comes to releasing a book into these different discovery pipelines. So how do you get these records out of Toad? There are several ways. There are two APIs. So there's the GraphQL API, which basically allows you to query the database itself through this syntax. It will give you then, you know, an output in the form of a JSON file. This is kind of the native file of Toad, you know, at the background. There is an export API, which is actually the most functional at the moment, in the sense that this really generates the records also for us. It allows you to specify, for example, that now I want from Punctum, which, you know, within the system we have this ID, so we copy that out of the system. I want for the entire Punctum catalog, I want Onyx 3.0 file according to the OAPN flavor, and then it generates you a fixed, stable link that we can just put on our website. Sorry, yeah, 5 minutes. That's excellent. That allows us to say to anyone, you know, if you want an updated, a fully updated version of our catalog in Onyx, you can just click this link. So these are, I think these stable links are very nice. And they also relate directly to the front end of the website that anyone could access. But it allowed you to, like, it has this little catalog interface where you can just download for every single book one of these metadata files. And as you can see here, it's a little bit small, but that basically links back to this export API, and it just simply generates this fixed link, stable URL. And finally, these are CC0 licensed, all of them. And this is actually the front end. I particularly like the fact that we have a logo in hieroglyphics. Right, so what is coming next for Toad? Very quickly. One of the things that a lot of smaller presses and, you know, young presses have issue with is, like, how do we know that our metadata are up to standard in order to get them into these discovery systems? So we're developing this traffic light system that basically tells you, at this point, your metadata record is good enough to be exported into this system, right? So it gives you targets as to, you know, improving the quality of these records by nudging the user into a direction of completing the record. We're looking into automated metadata dissemination to platforms. And this is a little bit of a problem in the sense that I'm not going to walk through all of these, but I have like small simplified graphs of how we're dealing with specific platforms. So for example, OAPN, we currently email an XML file and then they download the PDF linked in the XML file. JSTOR wants everything uploaded to a server. Google Books insists on crawling a different custom set of folders, right? So these are very different workflows. And we're trying to figure out how Toad can slowly help publishers in taking over part of these workflows. But with every single platform, that is basically a custom solution that we have to negotiate. But it's definitely the direction in which we're going once we get these records in place. And we are developing a business model to assure our long-term sustainability. So we're thinking to develop this type of freemium model in which the basic, all the basic services would be free, everything basically that I've shown today. And we would then help publishers, for example, with formatting, backlist ingest, enhancement and validation of metadata, as well as curated metadata delivery to different platforms, at a certain cost, which would help us, keep the servers online, keep, support staff, it's very small support staff, to make sure that the software doesn't deteriorate over time. And then also expand the ecosystem in which Toad lives. So the Open Book Collective, which is a platform that Copium is developing, Toad is a core aspect of that. We're looking into harmonizing with OpenAlex and Wikidata so that these metadata automatically also have a much wider distribution. I know that we're developing a white label website on top of Toad so that smaller publishers can just take the code, use Toad for the metadata, and have basically a website ready to go on top of that, which again, would lower the threshold for new publishers to enter the open access landscape, which is actually what we really want. We want more open access publishers. It has great potential for collaborative editing, and we have talked extensively with librarians about this. Why, and I know I am nearly out of time, why don't we start thinking about how we could curate and collaborate collectively on metadata creation, like basically a giant Wikipedia of metadata. This is kind of how we've been thinking about Toad as a possible future, namely as like this community managed universal book catalog. This is kind of our, pipe dream horizon. There are some resources here. Toad.pub is the website from which everything else you will be able to find. And if you would be curious to try out Toad, then we very much welcome that. We're currently in our tryout phase. 6 publishers are already using it rather successfully, and we very much hope that also library-based publishers would be interested in trying this out and giving us feedback, or even using it in their production, and come to talk to me or send us an email, either me or Rupert. Thank you.